We're alive.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. We'll call this meeting to order 6:04. So I'd like to welcome all of our administrators. Sorry we can't see you in person. See, I'll come on and I can wave. Let's see. That's it. You can't hear me if my face is on. So I want to thank all you guys. Obviously, we're in challenging times, and I want to thank all of our administrators for all your hard work, efforts, creativity, leading your schools. Obviously, everybody's doing an awesome job, and we're really proud of all of you. So this is the only opportunity I have to say that to all of you. So just know we appreciate everything you guys do every day. Okay, let's see. So we're in our budget workshop for the 21-22 budget. And I usually go right to Jim and turn it over to Jim. So Jim will give an overview, and then for the new school committee members, if anybody has any questions for our administrators, we will go to that after Jim finishes up. Okay, all yours, Jim.
All right, thanks. So before I start sharing my screen and talking through where we currently are in our process, let me just say that the one thing that we really have not completed at this point is I have not had individual meetings with each building principal to go through the line by line budget review. That's something that we do every year. But we were kind of focused in some other areas, which I will address this evening. So you'll see some pretty significant progress that we've made. I'm also going to share some ideas. Some of them are pretty out of the box about how we might be able to get to a more manageable place. And then I'll continue to update the committee at every subsequent meeting on whatever progress we make between meetings. So next week we have a meeting with the town councils, and I will be starting out with a presentation that is similar to what I'm going to do right now, but you will see some additional progress at that meeting as well. And I'll continue to update you along the way until we get to budget adoption time. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen. Jeremy, you're gonna have to give me permission. I forgot to ask.
There you go.
Thanks. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
I can see it.
Okay. Sorry, I have so many things to share. I opened the wrong one to start. Okay, so let me just say this will be a little bit challenging doing this virtually, but at any time feel free to stop me if I've lost you, and I will do my best to try to present this in a way that is understandable for the audience. So what I want to show you first is this is a sheet that looks very similar to what I presented the first time that we talked about the budget. So this was like the day or two after you received your initial draft. This spreadsheet actually goes back in time. So it shows you our budget from 2019. The operations budget was $33,387,864. And at the bottom, you can see that the population percentages in Exeter and West Greenwich were 46.12%, Exeter 53.88%, West Greenwich. That's the proportion of children that were attending school on October 1st of the prior year. That's how we determine the local impact for the two towns. In 2021, which is the year that we're currently operating in, the school committee approved a budget in May of $33,861,958, which represented just a 1.42% requested increase. That budget did not get approved by the voters, as we know. And so on August 11th, the school committee had to adopt a budget that turned out to be, you can see, less than what it was in the prior year. So FY20, we were at $33,387,864. And then for this year, on August 11th, the school committee adopted a budget that was at $33,136,558. So it was roughly $250,000 less than what the school committee had approved for the prior fiscal year. And that has to do with the fact that we lost a significant amount of money in state aid, and the towns level funded their contribution. So we did not make up that difference in state aid. So for the year that we are currently in, during the pandemic, with all the additional costs that are associated, we were able to manage that budget through some pretty strategic decisions, but also a little bit of luck and quite a bit of creativity. Some of the reductions that we made are temporary, and I know I've talked about those before with the committee, things like not replacing teachers that requested leaves of absence. Those teachers were in areas like art at the elementary school. We are just not offering art, and we are able to do that because of the schedule that is in place, the schedule that we had to put in place to address the requirements of reentry. So all of those things that we had cut, the Band-Aids that we cut in FY21 to address this issue, are back in this year's budget. So now we get to FY22, which is the budget that we are currently working on. So I just highlighted that column. On January 8th, I had presented to the school committee the initial draft. And again, the initial draft always comes in high, and it represents the total of all of the requests from every department, every school, every department head. Everything that they asked for is in. There was no review prior to the initial draft being shared, but certainly once that happens, we go right into analysis mode and we begin to refine and revise the budget, which is a several month-long process. For those of you that have been on the committee, you know what that looks like. So this is where we stood on January 8th of 21. We were at $34,616,726, which is roughly a $1.5 million requested increase over the prior year. And as you saw when that initial presentation was made, we had a significant population shift as well. So Exeter went from 46.25% of the enrolled population to 48.1%, almost a 2% increase, and it was the reverse for West Greenwich. So with that significant population shift and the amount of the increase, we calculated the impact on the towns to be 10.79% increase to Exeter and a 2.61% to West Greenwich. Again, that is because of the population swing. What I demonstrated also is if I simply put in, and I'll do it for the sake of just for the sake of demonstration. Let me just copy this so I don't lose it. If I put in last year's or the current year budget, the budget that we're currently working on. So again, this is what we're currently working on, 33,136,553. If we level fund and don't ask for any increase at all, which again would keep us below where we were a year ago, you can see at the bottom that the impact would be a 5.02% increase to Exeter, where West Greenwich would see a 2.73% decrease in requested allocation. That's based on the population shift. So you can see here through that demonstration that the population shift is very significant this year. On top of everything else that we're dealing with, it is a challenge, okay? So that was our starting point. And without getting into a ton of detail yet, although I will go into that with in my presentation. What you will see, and I'll go through the rationale for it, is that our current draft, the current draft of the budget, and I'm going to show you that in more detail in a minute, is at 34,021,321. So the initial draft was 34,616,726. The current draft is at 34,021,321. So I'm going to plug that in. Just so we can see. And you can see this percentages change at the bottom. So that the shift from where we started to where we currently are already brings the Exeter amount down to just shy of 8.5%, and West Greenwich goes up by roughly 0.5%. Remember, we started at 10.75 or so percent. So that's a pretty significant change already, roughly 2 full percentage points on the impact. Additionally, one of the things that we've done in the past is, and I'm not suggesting anything right now, that's a decision that the school committee has to make at some point. One of the things that we've done in the past is assign from our fund balance an amount of money as a revenue to help offset the impact. So that is a decision that I'm not going to ask for tonight, but certainly the school committee will have some time to discuss and make a final decision on that as we move forward. I have plugged in 0. Last year, we allocated $320,900, which is significantly more than what we typically allocate. And that's because of the crisis that we were in at the time that we were finalizing this budget. So that's a decision for the future. I will explain what this means a little bit further in the presentation, but we have an opportunity to assign some funds to offset the impact. Again, that will be a decision of the school committee, but I want to demonstrate, and we'll talk more about it in a couple of minutes. I want to demonstrate what the impact is if we make that allocation. Again, you can see at the bottom what's happening. Exeter continues to go down, West Greenwich down. Okay. We do have a new career and technical education confirmed tuition. We have our first one. We would expect that as we progress and as we continue to advertise, that we will have more and more tuitions that are added, and every new tuition is an increased revenue, and the increased revenues are the same as making a cut, right? So we can move us in the right direction by increasing our revenue or by decreasing our expenses. And you can see that, again, there was a little bit more of a reduction. I mean, it's not a lot, it's just one tuition, but it did create some movement. So with these adjustments, and these are not the only ones that we'll talk about today, there are some ideas that I want to share. These adjustments alone move us from about 10.75% to about 7.75% for Exeter. And West Greenwich is still below where they were in the prior year. Okay. All right. Any questions on this sheet? I know I didn't explain what this is, but I'm going to do that on the next slide.
Anybody have any questions? Okay.
All right. I can always call this back up later if I need to as well. Okay, so before I show the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about enrollment. And so one of the things that we looked at is why the significant shift in enrollment for next year. And again, we're using the October 1st numbers, October 1st from this year. And given the circumstances of the world right now, we know that we've lost a good chunk of kids to homeschooling, so they are not calculated in. But homeschooling numbers, when we did a closer analysis, yes, we have an increase in the number of kids that are homeschooled, but the proportion is fairly close to the proportion of the remaining kids. In other words, if it's a 52% population for one town and 48% for the other, the percentage of kids that have gone to homeschooling for this year mirror that same percentage. So it doesn't actually change significantly the overall figures. It doesn't account for the population shift. The other place that I wanted to look, which is actually quite more significant, is in the early grades. That's the preschool and kindergarten grades. Preschool and kindergarten are non-compulsory grades, meaning that it's not until first grade that a child is mandated to go to school. Parents have the right not to send their children to the non-compulsory grades. And we saw a pretty significant decrease in population at both grade levels, preschool and kindergarten this year, mostly from families that have opted to keep their children home in the face of the pandemic. So what I have done here is I've looked at preschool and kindergarten, and we looked at the enrollment numbers from the past 5 years, from 2015 to 2019. And these are right from the sheet that is included in your budget book, the one that gives historical enrollment. And so one of the things that you'll notice when we look at Lynham, which is our preschool, is that it is, we have, an average of 68 kids per year. If I look at the last 5 years, with a high of 74 and a low of 64, but the average over the 5 years is 68 children enrolled. And it is heavily skewed in the direction of West Greenwich, right? So in 2015, for example, only 35.9% of the enrolled preschoolers were from Exeter, while 64.1% were from West Greenwich. So it is a grade level that is always skewed in the direction of West Greenwich. So when we lose a segment of the population because families opted not to send, and that segment of the population that we've lost is heavily skewed in the direction of West Greenwich, that accounts for a chunk of that population shift. So I calculated the averages for the past 5 years from 15 to 19, and that should tell us what we were expected to see in terms of enrollment at our preschool. We should have expected to see 68 children enrolled, 23 from Exeter and 45 from West Greenwich, which represents the average proportion. What we actually had was 40% of the kids from Exeter, 60% from West Greenwich, and we were missing 15 children in total. So we lost a total of 15 from what we predicted. And again, based on proportion. So if we are looking at the average, what we should expect, we would have gained 2 additional kids from Exeter, and we would have gained 13 additional kids from West Greenwich. So that alone is a 15-child reduction, but it's an 11-child swing in the direction of West Greenwich. This is important for one of the things that we're going to talk about in a minute. I did the same exercise for kindergarten, again, taking the numbers right off of that historical enrollment spreadsheet. And although it is not as skewed in the direction of West Greenwich, you can see that historically it is. And the average over the 5 years is that roughly 45% of the children come from Exeter and roughly 55% of the children come from West Greenwich. But this year, the actual enrollment is 51.5% Exeter and 48.5% West Greenwich. Again, we've lost based on what we should have expected, which is 113 kids, the average of the previous 5 years. We've lost a total of 16 children. And if we expect the average distribution, we would have picked up 1 kid from Exeter and 15 kids from West Greenwich. So we've lost a lot of children that have skewed the shift of population as a result of families who have opted not to send their children to the non-compulsory grades. So between those 2 grade levels, there's a swing, a loss of 31 kids from what we should have expected, and 28 of those children we would have expected to be West Greenwich residents. A lot of the Exeter residents are sending their children to private preschool and K on a regular school year. The schools are closer to the West Greenwich area, so the West Greenwich families are taking advantage of Lynham and Wawaloon, again, on a typical year. So by doing this analysis, we can see that there's a swing of 25 kids altogether, right? 3 from Exeter, 28 from West Greenwich is a swing of 25 kids. And so if we were to add those 31 children that we lost, that we would have expected to see, if we look at the 2020 actual enrollment, that's with all the kids taken out for homeschool and the reduction in enrollment at preschool and kindergarten. If I just address these 31 children that are not in our schools, I would just add the 31 kids to the current enrollment of 1659. That would bring us to 1690. Exeter would, they currently have 798 kids. They would pick up 3 more. West Greenwich has 861 kids. They would pick up 28 more. And that would swing the population from 48.1% to 47.4% Exeter and 51.9% to 52.6% in West Greenwich. So it is not the full shift in population, but it is significant. 0.7% is a significant shift. It amounts to a lot of money. And what we then take away from this exercise is in the face of the pandemic, we have families that have chosen not to send their kids to the non-compulsory grade levels. But once we return to more of a normal circumstance, we are expecting to see families re-engage with the schools, and we expect to see our populations at the preschool and the kindergarten go back to the predictable levels, which again, I've determined based on looking at multiple years of data. So the message then to Exeter and West Greenwich is that if we look at the actual population right now, yes, there is a big shift. Yes, it negatively affects Exeter and positively affects West Greenwich. But next year, when we're going through the budgetary development process, we should, at a minimum, expect that swing to go back in the opposite direction when the preschool and kindergarten numbers go back to a more normal, place, and again, heavily skewed in the West Greenwich direction. So they're going to see a population increase the following year. So this just demonstrates that, depending on what happens with enrollment, we ride this roller coaster that we've seen in the past could really significantly impact a town in a negative way. But this year, based on this analysis, we know that part of the swing, at least part of the swing, is a direct result of the pandemic. So this is an important exercise that I wanted you all to see and to understand before I show you some of the ideas that we have for helping to bring the budget to a reasonable place before adoption. So are there any questions on what I've demonstrated here before I move on to the other spreadsheet?
Jim, I have a question.
Yes.
So I know that this analysis has to do with the changes in enrollment and how that impacts the local contributions, the percentage split there.
Yes.
Will you also have an analysis on how that impacts revenue related to the non-compulsory grades and state aid that's related to that as well?
So those are two completely different issues. Yes, so we are receiving state aid this year based on the October 1st enrollment numbers from 2019. Remember, we always do the enrollment in the prior year. So the current year state aid is not negatively impacted as a result of the reduction in the number of kids that are attending.
This year.
This year. But if we look at the October 1st enrollment from this school year, which is supposed to be used to determine state aid for the following school year, FY22, obviously with the reduction that I just demonstrated on top of the number of families that have left for homeschooling, which do not get counted as enrolled children, it is a loss, a significant loss. It's a loss that every school district in the state is experiencing. And we, through our organization, are addressing that issue with the governor's office and with the legislatures. So nothing has been finalized at this point, but we've engaged in some very healthy conversation. Everybody seems to be in agreement that we need to make a correction. And the latest that I heard is that they are looking to use the numbers, the enrollment numbers from the prior school year, the FY20 school year, to determine the FY22 allocations, so that no school would be negatively impacted by the reduction based on homeschool and early childhood enrollment. So that's the direction that it looks like we're moving. And the initial budget sheets that were posted on the RIDE website were consistent with that move. So it hasn't been enacted, it hasn't been finalized, but that seems to be the direction that we're going. On top of that, they're also looking to stabilize the free and reduced lunch numbers. I know that's something I've talked about as well. It's another very significant variable that affects state funding. And because our school system, as well as several others, applied to have permission basically to distribute free meals, our families that in the past were only able to get free meals through an application, and that application process is standardized across the state, right? They have to fill out the application, it gets approved. We report the overall numbers of families that have qualified for free or reduced meals. And that percentage of families is part of the formula that determines state aid. What we're finding, which again is consistent with most schools across the state, is that the number of families, even those that have previously qualified in past years, the number of families that are filling out the application has dropped drastically because there's no reason for them to fill it out. They already get free meals because we've qualified as an organization that can administer free meals, right? So the free and reduced lunch numbers have gone down as well. So as part of our discussions legislatively, as part of our discussions with the governor's office, with the commissioner, we are also looking to hold each school district to the numbers that were reported in FY20, so that no school district is negatively impacted by COVID-related variables. which is what we see here. So that's that, that's that part of the conversation. Now, in terms of the revenue that we receive, the only revenue that I can, well, there's a couple of different revenues. The first one is tuitions for preschool. So yes, we do have a reduction in tuitions for preschool. The way that the tuition system works is that if a child qualifies for services at the age of 3, they go to school for free, and that's state law. But we also open up enrollment to other members of the community on a tuition basis. Those are the families that are not sending their children this year. So yes, we are losing revenue in terms of preschool tuition. That does add up. It is not a massive number, but you will see as we progress in the school year that the allocation on our spreadsheet that we look at, called miscellaneous income, which is where we drop all of the preschool incomes, we're going to see that that number comes in lower than what it has in the past, because we're not collecting tuition from the preschool kids. So we're getting hit in that area as well. On top of that, we do have some children who are not coming to school who do qualify for additional services. And there is a Medicaid reimbursement process that we are able to take advantage of when we provide direct services to children in the schools. While most of those children are attending and we are able to capture a good chunk of the Medicaid reimbursement, we are definitely not capturing all of it. And we will see a reduction in Medicaid reimbursement as a revenue as well, again, as a result of the reduction in enrollment. And that's not just preschool and kindergarten. We have kids across the whole district that have gone to homeschooling. And so, yes, we are losing those revenues as well. I can't really think of additional revenues at the current time. However, let me think this through going forward. Obviously, Title I allocation is based on poverty rates, free and reduced lunches. And so we have a standard allocation that we receive from the federal government on an annual basis. This year's allocation based on FY20 October 1 numbers. FY22 allocation from the federal government should be based on this current year's numbers, which means that we would be expecting a reduction in some of our federal funds as well, unless there is a correction that is made. So the dominoes, as a result of what's happening, the dominoes can fall, and they are impacting us in a number of ways that you may not see immediately, right? But those are just 3 things off the top of my head to address your question. So yes, we are working on making the correction locally, meaning at the state level for state aid. I do not know if federally there will be any corrections that are made so that schools are not seeing massive decreases in title allocations. And so I'll just say this as well. For some school districts, if the state makes a correction, the state provides 80, 90%, in some cases 100% of their school district allocation. For us, the bulk of the money that we receive to run our schools does not come from the state. So even if they make the correction, it will only make the correction for the small percentage of funds that we get from the state relative to what we get from the locals. So, if we don't make any correction locally, then we go with the distribution of children based on the proportional share. And because it is skewed in one direction, particularly at the early grade levels, we see this huge population shift that is negatively impacting Exeter. So I have a proposal, and I have had some initial discussions. I want to share that, but I'll share it as part of my next screen with an updated spreadsheet, budget summary spreadsheet.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Terry?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions on this before I close this out and open up the last sheet? Again, I can come back to this, so no problem if there are questions that pop up later. Okay. So this spreadsheet is much longer, but the first 2 pages are exactly what you saw in the previous presentation, right? So the first page is the FY20. And what we approved in May, what the school committee approved in May for FY21, what you ultimately approved in August for FY21, and then the initial ask as a result of the budget entry for this year, for that FY22. Okay, so that's all the same. I want to focus on is pages 3 and 4. So on this page, what you can see is that I've plugged in the $34,021,321, which is the allocation that I plugged in on the previous sheet for you. It's kind of where we are in the process. And let me just tell you how we got from the initial ask of 34,616,726 to where we are now, 34,021,321. So on January 8th, that was what you saw. On January 20th, which is where we are today, we have chopped out just shy of $300,000. And let me just, in general, tell you where that comes from. There are, the bulk of that comes from salary and benefits. As I alluded to the last time we had a budget meeting, we found that there were a few people that were entered twice. So, they might have been entered by two different people, or, whatever happens. So they were entered a couple of different times. We've scrubbed the data to make sure that every person is entered, and they are only entered once. So we cleaned that up, got rid of duplications. And then on top of that, we have made some reductions at the school and department levels, although and I said we have not had those individual meetings yet. But I've started to at least engage in some discussion. And I'll tell you that, for example, at Wawaloom, we've already cut about 4,500. At Metcalf, we have cut about 26,000. At the junior high school, we've cut about 5,000. At the senior high school, we've cut about 7,000 so far. The bulk of that, you'll understand where it comes from in a second. But in technology, so Jeremy and I have had our conversation. We've cut out $20,000 from the technology department request, and that is accounted for in this subtraction of 298,954. And then today we actually cut out a tuition because we got confirmation that one of the tuition payments that we budgeted for is not going to be needed based on a different decision of the family. So we cut that out today. That was roughly a $40,000 expense. So about $300,000 has been cut with no impact on programs. Okay. On top of that 300,000, so if we subtract that 298,954, that brings us to 34,317,772. But I've indicated that we're at 34,021,321. So the rest of those figures are included below. First, I had kept in the budget the psychologist that we added through one of the relief grants that we've already received. We know that the social emotional needs of our children are not going away. It won't be magically better. So we kept that expense in the budget. What we now know is that the new federal stimulus that has been approved will be coming to us. We are expecting to receive a chunk of money that is significantly larger than what we got from the past 2 stimulus grants. And we have begun to hear the kinds of things that we can use that money for. And I might have reported already that it is really designed to be used on a go-forward basis, not to capture expenses from the past, but going forward, how are we going to continue to address the learning gaps that exist? And how are we going to address the social emotional needs that will persist? So given that, and that comes right from our conversations with the commissioner's office, but given that the psychologist that we added this year is a perfect match, perfect tie-in to what we can use this new grant money for. So we are going to reassign her expense to the new grant, which again is already approved at the federal level, but we're going to include that expense, which means I can take it out of the operations budget, and that's roughly $73,000, just shy of $73,000. So this is your running total of how I got down to this number. That reallocation, again, doesn't change a program. It keeps the service, but it moves it to the grant, which is an allowable expense for that grant. Okay. This is, let me explain what this is. There are $45,000 in the operating requests for FY22 that are one-time expenses, and they represent maintenance equipment. There is a new truck. One of our trucks is dead. The old truck that we have is dead. Remember, we do all of our own plowing, and without a truck, it is definitely a challenge. So that the replacement truck is in the budget. And then there's a scrubber. That's a floor scrubber for, they do it during vacations and summer work to keep the floors clean. One of our scrubbers has also died. That's a $10,000 expense. So those are 2 maintenance related expenses. They are one-time expenses. They are not things that need to be in the budget on an annual basis, but they need to be replaced. We have an opportunity to remove those items from the budget, the FY22 budget, and we do have the funding, and it would have to happen through school committee action. In fact, I included it on the agenda for next week's meeting, that we could vote to allocate funds from our unassigned fund balance to pay for these 2 items right now. We have the money available. We can do it. It gets us the equipment sooner, and it also allows us to reduce the request for FY22 by $45,000. So that's a recommendation that I have, and we'll follow it up with a school committee discussion and hopefully school committee action to allocate those funds in a different way so we don't have to put them in FY22. Okay, so that's what that one means. This is not a definite at this point, but we have been monitoring our healthcare costs. In the budget, we have included a 3% increase in health costs and a 0% and a 2% increase in dental costs. We do monitor that on a monthly basis. And a couple of things that we're seeing. Number one, we have a number of our individuals, and I reported this out at the last school committee meeting, a number of individuals continue to move from the more expensive healthcare option to the less expensive healthcare option for us. That's the HSA. That's a result of our negotiations from the last round. And we are seeing a pretty significant increase in the use of telemedicine. So here's one of the positives of what we've experienced through the pandemic. Telemedicine has been available, but it has been underutilized. And now people have been required to utilize it, and they're figuring out that it's really not that bad. So they've learned how to do something new. And so those expenses that we have for face-to-face visits have gone away, or at least been reduced significantly. And that, of course, impacts the cost of the plans. So we are tracking our expenses, and we believe at this point that within a short period of time, we'll be able to make the final decision that we do not need to actually budget for an increase in either healthcare or dental, because our expenses are coming in even a little bit less than what we would expect them to be based on the current rates that we have. So that would be roughly $153,000 in savings once we're able to pull the trigger on that decision. Again, it's what we expect to happen. We will continue to monitor, but I feel confident enough that we should at least put it on the table so you can see, what our thinking is. And then finally, in the budget, this has to do with some of the reductions that I reported out at the individual schools, because I'm sure some of the principals are on saying, well, how the heck did he cut $25,000 from my school? We haven't even had a conversation yet. The reason is that we continue to slowly move to replacing the interactive boards that are in classrooms. And while we put that off in the current school year, we want to pick it back up for next school year, particularly at Metcalf grades 4 and 5. Moving to the Prometheum interactive boards is in the budget, but it's in the budget as a straight buy, meaning, just for Metcalf alone, there was roughly $30,000 for these boards in the budget. Then we had 2 or 3 at Wawaloom, I think 3 at Wawaloom, another 3 at the junior high school. So in various locations, we had these boards in the budget. What I did was I worked with Jeremy and said, listen, if we take all of them out of the budget as full buys, which is what we typically don't do, we don't put them in and just buy them in 1 year and call it a day. We have enough where we could go the lease option, spread the cost out over 3 years, and put that in the budget. So they'll still get what they need, but we've basically cut the expense by about 60% from what was originally budgeted. So that is a $25,000 savings. That brings us to a reduction of just shy of $600,000. That's inclusive of all these things that we just talked about. $600,000 off of the initial request of $34,616,726, and that's where we ended here, the $34,021,321. So if I take the initial request and subtract out everything that I just talked about, it brings us here, which again, I feel pretty confident about, that this is a good place for us. I mean, we still have more reductions to make, but I feel pretty confident in what I've already reported. Again, with the vote of the school committee on this, with the final decision made on this. Okay? Questions so far? Okay, because now we're going to get super creative. Okay, next. We, again, in our budgeting process, we always on an annual basis have this conversation. Are we going to make an allocation from available surplus to the revenue side of the budget so that we can offset the impact? I always start at 0 because, as we've said, it is a structural deficit, meaning we take it, it's a one-time, and then we have to vote on it again. We have to hope that we have those extra funds in unassigned fund balance on top of what we're required to keep by policy. And we've been lucky enough to be able to use those funds during some pretty difficult times, including this allocation that we made in August for the current year. We had to make a decision to chop some things or make up the difference by unassigned fund balance. We had it, we used it. So we've gone from 320,900 to, in actuality, we only need 249,525, partially because we saw a huge increase in tuitions, CTE tuitions, above what we originally budgeted. We had a lot of kids that committed after the fact, and so we didn't need as much. But we've gone from $250,000 to 0. So again, the school committee has the option, and we'll talk about it, but you do have the option to make a decision to allocate a revenue there, as we have done multiple years in the past. On top of that, this is something that at central office we've been talking about in fact, we started this conversation last year. We never acted on it last year, but the circumstances of this year have really forced us to think very differently. So this line, this assigned OPEB reserve, I want to explain what that means. It has never appeared on my budget spreadsheet before. This is completely new. Again, this would require some school committee discussion and some commitment on the part of the school committee that this is a decision that is worth exploring and worth us moving forward on. But you recall that in 2016, those of you that are on the school committee, in 2016, we had a good chunk of money in unassigned fund balance, and you voted to move $275,000 into an OPEB trust account. So OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. The design was that we would be addressing these post-retirement expenses by putting a fund in place. I think ideally we would have liked to continue to add to that fund and just keep building it so that it was not being reported in our audit as this expense that we didn't have the funds to account for. What we have typically done is just include those expenses on an annual basis in the operating request. So all of the post-employment costs are in the operating budget that we have here, which is the way that we've always done it. Okay. You are going to see at next week's school committee meeting that we are sitting on a pretty good chunk of money in unassigned fund balance right now. And we also have a pretty good chunk of money in the West Bay collaborative balance. And that's something that you get a report on through Bob's status report on a monthly basis. We did make a decision several years back to use that money from the WB in a different way. And that really came back to bite us a few years later when the cost of health insurance went through the roof. And we had to then budget for massive increases, which we would have had to budget for anyway. But these massive increases, it was hard for us to come back from that. So one of the things that we're talking about, we're having conversations internally, but also we are scheduling a meeting with our auditor to make sure that that if we move forward with this, we do it in the right way, is that if we do a withdrawal from the WB, that we would allocate that money to post-employment benefits, healthcare benefits. So in other words, we withdraw from a health account, we use it for health-related expenses. And the OPEB account is designed for post-employment healthcare expenses. So it's a nice clean move. Again, it requires some action on the school committee part, but it's part of the conversation that we'll have at next week's meeting. So we're going to have that discussion. We're going to ask the school committee, make a recommendation that the school committee allocate some additional funds to that OPEB reserve that we set up back in 2016 and haven't done anything with. And then on an annual basis, for as long as we can, and the way that I calculate it out based on the recommendations is that this is something that we can do for at a minimum the next 5 or 6 years based on what we're going to ask you to do at the next school committee meeting. So we have money in this reserve, and then we allocate a portion of the expenses to a revenue in our budget. So for example, right now, through an analysis of the existing budget, there is just shy of $275,000 worth of post-employment benefit expenses in our FY22 operating budget. So from the account that we have set aside for post-employment benefit costs, we are going to suggest that we take 60% of the actual post-employment costs and assign from that reserve set aside, the post-employment reserve set aside, assign that as a revenue on the revenue side of this spreadsheet here, assign OPEB reserve of 164,948. That may change depending on how the post-employment retirement benefits change, you know, if new people decide to retire or whatever, but it adds a brand new revenues to the equation that offsets roughly $165,000 worth of expenses that have been budgeted for. So that's a very out of the box thing. It is a way to use the WB, but it is a direct correlation between where the money comes from and what it is being used for. That's cleaner for the auditors, cleaner for us, and it makes use of the OPEB set aside that we originally started to talk about back in 2016. So that is one decision that could be made. And then the final one is a big one. So what I have done is I have over here looked at the 2021-22 budget and basically filled everything out, you know, just like we did on that last version that we were just going over. You know, we're down to the 34,21,321. I've included everything. I've included the extra tuition. I've included the allocation from the OPEB reserve. I've included all the changes that we've made. The other thing that I did is I plugged in the percentages that we saw in the enrollment analysis that I shared earlier. School and kindergarten enrollment analysis. The families that we lost who did not send their children to school because it's a non-compulsory grade level, and they just chose to keep the kids home given the state that we were in the pandemic. We should expect those children to return. We should expect the early childhood numbers to go back to normal next year, which would create a swing back in the opposite direction for West Greenwich. We have an opportunity to think outside the box, just like we're asking the state to make an adjustment because of pandemic-related circumstances. We have an opportunity to ask the town to make an adjustment that does not hurt or benefit one town or the other. It simply spreads out the distribution of funds over 2 years instead of everything hitting in 1 year. So by using these figures, which should have been what we expected to see if preschool and kindergarten enrollment stayed stable, the amount for West Greenwich would be this. The amount for Exeter would be this. The shift is that it is roughly a $200,000 swing. So these population percentages create new local impact numbers that roughly swing approximately $200,000 worth of expenses. So again, Exeter would have to pay this year. These expenses would swing right back in the direction of West Greenwich the following year. This year, West Greenwich is actually in a position where they may see a reduction in expenses, and then they can predict an increase in expenses the following year. We have an opportunity to at least engage in a discussion to say, look, if these are the expected percentages just based on early childhood, which creates a roughly $200,000 swing, you make the correction here by saying, let's make that correction right now, where Exeter is getting hit significantly in a bad way, and West Greenwich is looking at a reduction. So you make that adjustment this year, right? It's a simple subtraction from Exeter and an addition to West Greenwich. That brings Exeter's number down to 6.2%. It's still higher than what we're allowed to do. But remember what I said, population shift alone put us at 5.02%. And it brings West Greenwich to 1.16%, which is, again, significantly low. You make that adjustment next year, and then this year, and then when we're developing the budget the following year, you make an adjustment in the complete opposite direction. So because we expect West Greenwich to swing back, if we make the adjustment next year by subtracting, it actually puts them back to a level place, and it allows Exeter to kind of spread out the impact of the population shift over 2 years, as opposed to managing it all right now in this budget cycle during the pandemic. It's a $200,000 swing. It's based on some sound math, and at the end of 2 years, the net result is zero. We're just spreading it out in a more strategic way. You know that I did talk about this offline with Kevin Breen. I went over and had a conversation with him. I said, this is something that I'm thinking about. I want to explore this a little bit further. I wanted to get a sense from him on where he, what his thinking was. And he was open to the conversation and suggested that I need to present, just like I did tonight, I need to present that to the town councils. And he said, let's put it on the table. So, it wasn't a hard no. It definitely out of the box, but it is a strategy that really shifts. It's a $200,000 swing, but it's actually a $400,000 swing, because it's minus 200,000 for one town and plus 200 for another. And it knocks that percentage down to 6.2 from where we were on that previous sheet, which was over 7 at that point. So this is another big out of the box idea that is different from cutting. So I know that's super confusing. Before I move on with my presentation, I don't have much left, but before I move on, just wondering what people are thinking about those last two ideas in particular, which are new.
They're speechless, Jim.
Jim, I just say to the group that the apportionment has been vexing to the communities since I got here.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past, 4 years, 4 years ago, now maybe 5, we had a charter review committee that was looking at trying to figure out apportionment. And I think this is as creative a way as possible, and may begin the pivot towards looking at flattening the swings in the enrollment, because it can have a substantial impact to the local taxpayer and the people who support us, as well as devastating consequences to the budget, trying to get down to the 4%. And it's at some point, prior to COVID, the tuition band was supposed to start to climb again. And when not tuition, the enrollment was supposed to start climbing again. And when that happens, that's not a cheap endeavor. So anything that we can do to support trying to figure out this apportionment is worth it. For those who don't know, there's 4 regional school districts. Every district handles it a little bit differently. And I think this is a good start, and I applaud the superintendent for trying to bridge that conversation. So that's all I got.
I think that conversation, Bob, will naturally come up if we bring this idea up at the joint meeting of the town councils. I think the topic itself will naturally come up. And it might be an opportunity for us to engage a little bit more seriously in that conversation, because whatever town gets hit in that year, it's a bad conversation to have. You know, I remember West Greenwich getting hit by a 7% increase, and Exeter got hit the following year. We went a couple of years where it was pretty good. Like the change last year was so insignificant that it was almost nothing. It was like a $34,000 swing last year. And then this year, it's an incredible shift. And neither town could handle that shift in any 1 year unless we try to do something very creative. I mean, the starting point was 10.79%. I mean, that's unmanageable, obviously. So.
Jim,
So
has there been,
am I crazy, or are people interested?
for the OPEB assignment idea, has there been a precedent? Has other districts explored an option like this before that they've been able to implement?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think OPEB is a point of issue on many school districts' audits, because they all have expenses for post-employment, but nobody really has funds that are set aside. I mean, the way that we've always managed it is that we just budget the expenses on an annual basis, right? It's just part of our operating budget. But it always shows up as a recommendation in our annual audit. I mean, it's not a black mark. It's not something that we did wrong, but it's always a recommendation that we figure out a way to start setting funds aside.
Yeah.
And I think that we have an opportunity to actually increase what we currently have, but also utilizing some of it this year, in a year where our circumstances are as severe as they've ever been. You know, and then on an annual basis, we could make a decision to allocate funds from unassigned fund balance, if that's what we needed to do, allocate from the OPEB reserve, if that's what we needed to do, or do neither in a year where it's not necessary. But I think of all years, this is a year where we should be looking at everything. So that's where the recommendation is coming from. I can try to find out for you, Andrea. I have not heard of any other district that has done something like this. Bob and I, we always talk about these crazy ideas. We were having a conversation today about this. It's an idea. We would want to make sure that we're doing it absolutely consistent with whatever laws and parameters the auditor would want us to do. We want to make sure that we do it right. We want to make sure that we're not breaking any rules. So we have a conversation that we're going to have with the auditor. And then, hopefully we'll have a lot more information on that even prior to our next meeting together. We can give you the recommendations and whether we have the go ahead, at least legally, through our auditor, or if there are things that we have to do to manage that a little bit differently. But it's an idea. We think it's reasonable, but it is very different.
Yeah. I noticed too that there was disproportionate shift in out of district schooling too, where it seems like Exeter went up and West Greenwich went down this year. And considering, you know, if we do pull, as you said, there was a student who came back, not only do we gain their tuition back, but then we also don't have to spend for those that we have to pay for transportation.
Correct.
Do we reach out to families periodically to say like, hey, we've got these new programs, or, you know, how are you?
Yeah. So in particular, I mean, I can answer that question in two different ways because it varies by level. At the high school level, we have, and this actually starts with our 8th graders. Prior to, I think maybe 3 years ago, 3 years ago, Bob, maybe 4 years ago, is the first time that we actually tuition kids into our school. We didn't offer state approved career and tech programs.
Correct.
And so when a child wanted the experience of one of the CTE programs, the only option they had was to apply to one of the neighboring schools, Charahoe, Coventry. But most high schools at this point have expanded their offerings, have at least one career and tech approved program. And so we did some surveys of the kids. We wanted to find out what their interests were. So we are able to, because of the programs that we're currently running, and you know that we're working to bring more, for the first time, we're able to bring kids in who want the programs that are not offered in their school. So we were strategic. We wanted to offer things that were not offered around us. And we also have cost avoidance in the sense that, you know, a child maybe doesn't have to go somewhere else to get access to a state approved program that they otherwise would have had to get by leaving. So at the high school level, we've tried to address that issue through the career and tech, the pathways and the career and tech approved programs. You know, the first year that we had a tuition, it was one kid. So we showed a revenue of about $13,800 that year. That's it. Now we're up to, we're going to be over 200,000 for the first time. So, you know, that will continue to grow, fingers crossed. And as we expand programs and open up additional opportunities, we expect that revenue will continue to grow. And on top of that, we can't always measure cost avoidance because there are kids that have chosen not to leave since we offer the program in-house. That's our solution right now at secondary. The big challenge that we have is the charter schools, particularly in the early grades, the early grade charter schools. And there are 3 charter schools in particular that are located geographically in our area. So the first is the Green School, which is actually located geographically in our region. And we have less than a handful of kids that go there on an annual basis. Most of them choose to stay in our high school, or they might go to a career and tech school that offers a program that we don't have. But there are 2 charter schools that are near the URI campus, Kingston Hill and Compass, where we have a huge number of children who attend on an annual basis. They are elementary age. One of the schools goes up to grade 8. But geographically, they are in some cases across the street from where the children in our community live. So, you know, somebody that lives in the Saunderstown area, like the Preservation Drive up in that area, way up in Exeter, almost on the URI campus, they are in our region to go to our schools, but they can see one of those charter schools from their yard. And so a lot of the families choose to go there because it's far more convenient for them. That's an issue that we face. And that's why you see, and it's consistent year to year to year, that's why you see a much higher percentage of children from Exeter attending out of district because of those 2 schools in particular. It's like the Lynham preschool percentages, except in reverse. You know, they're heavily West Greenwich at the Lynham preschool, but they are very heavily Exeter at Compass and Kingston Hill. So I don't know how to manage that, because parents have the right to make that choice and we pay. But I have to believe, based on the conversations that we've had, for the bulk of the families, it is, you know, they're smaller schools, but above all else, they're right across the street from where they live. And so it's geographically convenient.
That makes sense.
You know, the other thing that happened this year too is some of the kids that we lost, you know, we lost some kids in the early grades. I went through that analysis. We lost kids to homeschool from both towns. But we also had an increase in the number of families that sent their children to private schools for a variety of reasons, right? I mean, there was a hybrid model. We had to adjust our times. Parents were concerned about the larger school. Metcalf is our biggest school. It's elementary. We had full in-person return. There were a lot of families that said, I don't want to homeschool. I don't want to send my child to a large school. For next year, I'm sending them to a private school. They may choose to stay there, but they may also choose to send them back, because for a lot of these families, it was a 1 year decision based on the circumstances and based on what they could do, you know, for their individual needs. So that also accounts for some of the shift. And we have always traditionally had a higher number of kids from Exeter make those decisions for a variety of reasons. A lot of it is geographic.
Ding.
Yeah. I just got texted by the principal who has conversations with a lot of our parents. It's really also about the bus ride. Like, a lot of parents don't want their kid on the bus for an hour each way. And, you know, when you're hopping on the bus almost on the URI campus and you have to make multiple stops on your way to school, and then you hop on the bus to go home after, and you have to make multiple stops before you get dropped off, you're spending 2 hours a day on the bus. For some kids, that is not a good experience. You know, they're just not good on the bus for that amount of time. And it's a challenge. You shorten the bus ride by 59 out of 60 minutes each way. I mean, there is some convenience to it. And that's what some of our families do. Mrs. Donovan, I can see that you want to say something. We've been together for a long time now.
I understand it, you know, I mean, that's a real challenge, and it's a geographic reality. And when you've got little kids with little bladders, that's a long ride and a big chunk of their day. And, you know, if you're that parent, what's the downside? What's the downside of sending your child to one of those charter schools? You know, I could argue about the education that they receive in our schools, but you know, from their point of view, it's a practical decision. You know, and not that it should matter. Parents, you know, unless they're sending their children to, you know, tuitioned private schools, their decisions that they're making for their children's education should be based on the education that's provided, and not what the impact is, you know, the fiscal impact on the communities per se. But it's a reality. So, you know, part of the budget discussion, you know, there's a lot of things that are beyond the district's control with regard to our revenue sources and circumstances, you know, the state and federal government impose. And this is another one of those things. This is beyond our control, but it has a significant fiscal impact. And so it's decisions that parents make that has an impact on the budget, not to dissuade them from making that decision for their children and their family, but there's a cause and effect that, you know, most people are probably not aware of, certainly town council members.
They're aware.
Well, they're becoming aware.
They're becoming aware.
Everybody understands the fiscal impact of charter schools now. You know, we've known it for a long time, but I think it's just starting to really hit home with a lot of people when they see those numbers.
Yeah, it is a very large cost in our budget. You know, you start adding up the tuitions that we pay. It is a large expense because again, as Member Monroe said, it's not just the tuition that we pay, but we also transport.
Right.
And, you know, so it's more than just the tuition.
Right. Any input from the administrators?
I'll just say thank you, Jim, for all the creativity, and Bob, all your input to come up with some ideas that are so far outside of the box. I couldn't even imagine it going into this meeting, as you said, Jim, earlier today.
I said some of you might be a little surprised because there's some things that you've never seen before.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, I don't know. Ultimately, I am not making all the decisions, you know, but I think in these circumstances, we said we were gonna really try to think more creatively than ever because our circumstances are as bad as they've been since my arrival here. So I think
there's some ideas on the table. So
yeah.
I think another nice thing to say about this is that Jim's being creative about ways to help out with the budget without impacting the programs and the quality education that we deliver. And that's a huge thing is, you know, we can say what a great program. You know, I'm at the junior high. I will tell you every year I get 5 to 10 parents over the summer calling and asking if they can send their kids from neighboring towns in the junior high. And they don't have that choice at junior high. I tell them to hang on and come for the high school. But, you know, it's because we have a great program and we continually have really good educational programs and people want their kids here. And that's what we're not sacrificing. So on that end, I appreciate the creativity so that it's not saying, let's get rid of the different programs that are doing really great service for our kids. But instead, we're looking at creative ways in a time that, you know, we got to be super creative with budgeting and with money and finance. So I appreciate that on our end. We haven't even had to have the discussion of, do we need that shredder? I'm never getting a shredder, just telling you, we put it on my budget every year. It gets cut before we ever get to it, which is fine. But it's one of those things where, you know, I'm looking at cutting a shredder. I'm not looking at cutting a staff person. I'll cut the shredder. I'll keep my interventionists and keep the programs that help the kids. So
just for the administrators, while you're on a high right now, we still have to have our annual meeting to look at this.
Yeah, we know.
we're ignoring that tonight, Jim. We're ignoring that.
I figured.
I think also finding a way to keep the social emotional supports in there is humongous, especially during this time. So that's also greatly appreciated.
And not just during this time, we're going to need that for a while to come.
I agree.
The impact will be, I think, long lasting as we, you know, re-enter.
I agree. So with everything that I presented, again, you know, we have a lot of discussions that we need to have, and we will. But if all of that flies, we took from where we started, we're down, Exeter's impact is down like 4.5% from our starting point, which is not easy to do. And we will continue to look at, again, the line by line, school by school. There'll be some additional reductions. You know, we may have more tuitions that typically happens. That could increase our revenue. That will help. Every little bit helps. We will continue to look at staffing. We've not finalized course selection at particularly the secondary school. We need to look at the impact of re-enrollment at the elementary schools. We've budgeted for what we predict is going to happen based on re-enrollment. But there could be some opportunities potentially where a staff member that we've budgeted for isn't necessary based on actual re-enrollment. So it's something that we have to pay attention to. Like, we have opportunities for additional reductions. We can get these numbers down. I don't know that we can get Exeter down to 4 because, like I said, the starting point just based on population shift alone put them at 5. And that's town charter. That's not us. But this, where we stand right now at the 6.2 and the 1.16, it represents under a 4% increase. And that's from a starting point that was less than the prior year operations budget. So that's pretty remarkable. It will only go down. I don't know that we can fully resolve Exeter's problem, but they're in a much better spot than where our starting point was. And in order for us to get to 4, we would have to actually start looking at cutting programs. And I don't know that that's not something that the school committee has been keen on in the past. You like to add things, not subtract them. That's been my experience. Ms. Donovan, can you see your text?
Let me see.
I think you're now running the meeting because Claudine can hear us, but nobody
Oh,
can.
really? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, geez. Okay.
So she said, if there's anybody else that has questions or want whatever it is that you want me to answer, I'm happy to do that. But if she can't get her sound back, then once we're done with questions, she wants you to wrap it up.
Okay.
Cheryl has her hand raised.
Cheryl?
Yes, sorry, I was just waiting for the go ahead. I have a question about things that were possibly underutilized or not used at all due to the pandemic. For example, the athletic budget, I was just noticing things like officials, referees, coaches, things that, because we had a couple of sports that never took place.
Yep.
And things like that. Is that possible for funds like that to be carried over? I mean, I know there's that possibility of that shortened spring season. Who knows? But there's been a lot of games canceled due to quarantine.
Yeah. So good question. One of the things, if you may recall that when we were having the discussions about how we would balance this year's budget, one of the things that we indicated was that we were going to cut about $150,000 out of extracurricular, meaning athletics and clubs, which we did. And we assumed that most of those savings would be realized not by us cutting anything, but just by the limitations on the pandemic. So we actually planned for $150,000 reduction. We put it in the budget as $150,000 reduction. And we're on track to meet the $150,000 reduction without actually having to cut anything. So that was accounted for as part of how we got to a balanced budget this year, in spite of the fact that we were starting from $250,000 lower than the year before. But it's also the reason why, if you looked at your budget binder, you see that there's a huge increase in what we budgeted for this year in athletics compared to
I
what
did
we
see
budgeted
that.
next year. But the reason is that we made cuts because we knew there were going to be savings based on the pandemic. And we put all that stuff back in for next year because we're predicting we won't have the same restrictions.
Okay, great. Yeah, and to clarify, I do not want to see those things cut.
Oh, I know.
I was just curious if there was any savings.
I know personally, I'm very clear on that point.
Great, glad you are.
Yeah, so one of, and connected to that discussion is, we are in the auditing process right now. We do not have a final audited end of year balance from last year, but we also had savings last year. We closed schools from March till the end, and we didn't need substitutes, and we didn't need, we didn't run athletics that last season of athletics. We didn't need buses. There were a lot of things that we did not spend money on that were in the budget for last year. And all of those expenses that were budgeted for, we knew that we had savings. We actually utilized some of those savings. You recall that I asked you to buy out those leases, so we had extra devices for the families that needed them. That was all based on what we knew was going to land on the bottom line for us at the end of last year. When we do the fund balance presentation next week, you will see that there is more money that landed in the unassigned fund balance just from last year than we even predicted. So we had a lot of savings even from last school year. And that does drop to the unassigned fund balance. That gives us the ability to utilize that money for different kinds of assignments. That's why I'm saying, and again, I'm going to go through that whole presentation with you next week, but that's why I'm saying, pull the truck out, pull the scrubber out. We can buy them right now, use the money that's left over. We have the money, get it out of the FY22 budget. It gets us what we need. It gets us what we need early. It reduces next year's ask. It's not an annual request. It makes sense that we can do that. That's why it made sense for us to assign $390,000 from unassigned fund balance last year in the circumstances that we were in August, because we knew that we had a ton of money that we didn't spend in the previous year. So there are opportunities that exist right now for us based on the flexibility of unspent money from the previous year. This year, it was a little bit tighter because yes, we had some savings, but we actually predicted what a lot of those savings were, and we used that to balance the budget based on the circumstances that we were in August when our budget was voted down. So if that helps you kind of put it in context. Did I answer your question, Cheryl?
Yeah, great.
Okay, good.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Wow, it's really hard for me not to talk. I'm sitting here like a little, I don't know, I'm just like, I'm talking, nobody's hearing me.
Well, say what
Okay.
you have to say while we have you.
I know, I'll need like 15 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. So I just want to say, Jim, thank you. Bob, thank you. Obviously appreciate your creativity. I love the OPEB WB idea. Every time we talk about WB, if there's money in it, it ends up creating a structural deficit. And this is like this scenario that you're proposing. It doesn't do that, which is what we're always trying to avoid. And every year it seems like we're always, we're kind of creating structural deficits here and there. So I love that idea. We don't have as much control, obviously, about the other idea with the towns, paying a little more, paying a little less. That's up to the town councils. I think that the explanation and all your mathematician work, Jim, is awesome, and it will help justify it. But that we'll have to leave that up to them to decide, I guess. Okay, Jim, just for, I know Andrea is the only new member right now, but the SRO, I just want to make sure she's not going to know what we do with the SRO. So just tell her that's back in the budget, because that's a big chunk, 122.5.
Yes. So last year, again, when we were, making our final decisions to get to a balanced budget, one of the things we asked is that the towns pick up the cost of the school resource officer, which they did. Typically, that is included in our operations budget. They agreed to do it. They shared the cost. They agreed to do it for the year. They asked us to put the expense back in the budget the following year. So for FY22, I have done that. So part of our increase, about $125,000 worth, is the cost of the school resource officer, which came out of the budget last year, but I've been asked to put it back in this year.
Yep, so that's a big chunk. And then Jim, just because I've had a few parents calling me on the AP exams, and I know that Sue budgeted for the AP exams.
Yes.
It looks like $12,000. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So I think what I saw was more, but I could be wrong. So there was a decision that crossed. It came out of the commissioner's office after our budget was approved last year. I think it came in the summertime, actually.
Yeah.
So our budget was approved. There was a parent from another school district that went to the commissioner's office regarding paying fees to take the AP exams. And the ruling was that if a school district required children to take the AP exams as a requirement of the course, then the school district is responsible for the fees, even though it's a college level class where the kids are getting credit at college if they pass that exam. We had never budgeted for that money in the past. In the past, we had required it, but we did not budget it. And so we made a decision that we would not be requiring it last year. And we didn't have to anyway, because the pandemic kind of, the organization, the AP organization changed the rules and told kids that they had the option. Once that decision came, we made a decision that we would not make it mandatory in this year because we had not budgeted the funds. But we have budgeted those expenses for next year because we do want our kids to take the test. It's important for them, but it's also important for us. It's part of our accountability ratings as well. The more kids that take and pass that test, the better for us. We know that our kids are very, very well prepared. All of our AP offerings have exceptional pass rates. So we want to be able to require it. In order for us to do so, we have to pay for the test. It's not a, in a $34 million budget, it's not the end of the world, but it's not an expense that we had ever budgeted for. We have accounted for that for next year. Is that what you were looking for, Claudine?
Yeah, so I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that's a new expense in the budget, but I also wanted to mention that I know a lot of kids can't use those credits in college, whether colleges don't accept because the courses we're taking at their high school. There's a variety of reasons. So I know it's a big benefit to us to have kids take the test, whether it be the AP honor roll, something in the accreditation, feedback for us on how the course they're going. There's a lot of benefits. So I just wanted to say I'm a proponent of when you meet with Sue, not cutting the AP exam expense.
Yeah, that's not even on our radar. That we know that that's an expense that we have to keep in.
Okay, good. Because I do think, like I said, I think a lot of kids won't take the exam because I do think a lot of kids cannot use those credits.
But they definitely want the bump in their GPA.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So they all enroll, and if we require it, they will take the test and they will do well. So that's what we want to do, but we can't do it unless we pay the fee. So we're
exactly. Yeah, I mean, we got to require it and we have to pay it. I mean, the kids need to show the rigor when they're applying for colleges. That's the biggest thing for them, is showing the rigor.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just a book question. The health services, do we always put those under each school?
So as you know, we transitioned to a new system, and we're using it for the first time to develop budget reports, and we're working out some of the kinks. In the past, we always we always printed out the health budget for the district in a separate section of your budget books.
Yeah.
This year, so we always actually budgeted it by school, but then we pulled all of those things out and created a separate report, just a health expense report. This year, we left the expenses in by school, but you can still do a year-to-year comparison because the prior year expenses kind of carry over. If you want us to work on going back to having a separated out health budget for the district, we certainly can do that. Too late for the first draft for this year, but that's something we can work on to get it right next time around.
Okay. I mean, there's never a huge change in it. And I mean, it's always stuff obviously that we need, our nurses need, but
Yep.
I guess it's nice to see the comparison year to year. Whereas if it's in each individual school, it's kind of harder to compare.
Yeah, understood. I'm wondering if the committee has any specific questions for principals. I want them to be able to have a little bit of their night before they get ready for tomorrow. If we can release them, that would be great. And again, there may be more questions as we move through the process, but we have not had those individual meetings yet. So next thing on our list, so I'll meet by school and I'll report out on the changes that we agreed to as part of that normal process. But I don't know if there are specific questions that principals and directors and assistant principals can help with before if you don't mind, we can release them.
Yep. Andrea?
I have one more question, just going back to the revenue side of things. For the CTC programs, I think I remember last year's budget meeting, there was, or maybe a meeting prior to that, there was some discussion about revamping the marketing plan for the CTC. I don't know if I'm misspeaking there. But okay, do you guys have some details on how we're reaching out and recruiting kids?
Yeah, Stacy, you and I talked about that today. Can you address that question?
Yeah, so we actually have some ads going out in 4 local papers in their education sections starting next week. It's for the next 2 weeks. And then we will be doing the following 2 weeks just for our local area one, The Resident. We are in the process of putting together an open house event. Last year we did it a little bit late. This year we'll be doing it in early February for not only our CTC students we are trying to recruit, but for our own 8th graders to encourage them to stay here. We did that last year to kind of highlight all the exciting programs we have for them. And so those are the 2 things. And we are also in the process of doing a mailer, working with a graphic designer to do a mailer, but that's kind of on hold with everything that's been going on with COVID in the post office. We decided to try some other tactics right now because it's a little bit difficult to actually bring kids into our building, which is what we were hoping to do.
And Stacy, last year, one of the things we talked about was the website, so when families were going to the website, it wasn't as comprehensive as we wanted it to be, but I know that you worked on that, you and Sue and
Jeremy, we redesigned the whole website. So there's descriptions under a tab for new families, college and career readiness, that explains all of our programs and has an icon for kids to apply now. And Jeremy and I actually, at the end of this year, are going to make sure we kind of put in our calendars that every few months we check it and make sure there's not any updates that need to be made to it. And just
have we included the link to that site in the mailings or in the?
Yes, yep. It's included in the ad that's going to be in the papers, and it's part of the mailer that we're designing. We also have a QR code that we can actually send out for the kids to apply.
And then when we post about the open house on the website, I push it out on social media. I tried last year. I spent $10 of my own money to do a Facebook ad and boost the reach, and it really worked well. So we'll probably look at doing that again this year.
And does that include? Sorry.
And we also are, speaking of social media, have someone at the high school who wants to take over kind of creating social media sites to push all this out. Greg Charest, who's our band director, is looking at all the different platforms. That's something new we're going to be doing this spring that we had not done in the past as well, to kind of push out all our information out of various sorts of social media outlets. And
I appreciate it, because I know that last year when we were engaged in these conversations, I know Sue and I talked, and you and I, Stacy, talked, and then Jeremy got involved, and I know you guys involved some of the teachers. But after we took some of those, you know, I know that there was work involved, but they're pretty low risk steps. And shortly after those steps were taken, we saw an increase in the number of approvals that we had. Like, you know, post budget, we went up like, I want to say it's like $70,000 or $80,000.
$70,000, yeah.
Yeah, like $70,000. So we had an additional 70 grand in tuitions that came in after those steps were taken, after the budget was developed, which is really awesome, and it speaks to the need for us to continue with that. I'm glad to hear that we're doing it a little earlier this year too, because maybe we can capture some of those additional tuitioned in students before we get to the point where we have to finalize a budget. And I really would love to account for as much revenue as possible so that we vote on a budget that has the least impact, as a minimum impact as possible on the taxpayers, which I think is important.
And the last thing I do want to add is Marie and I have been working with teachers to kind of create some new programs, as Jim mentioned earlier. We do have 3 in the works. However, RIDE is not accepting new applications this year, unfortunately, as I think you might have already been told.
Yeah,
So
Marie,
we are
committee on that.
We are, but those kids who are in some of, it's in 2 of the pathways will be able to get those endorsements from the commissioner, even though they're not CTE ones that we can recruit for. So.
Good.
Very good.
Thank you.
Everybody's all set? Okay. I think Jim, I think we can wrap up the meeting, not just let the principals go.
All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining. And I'll be in touch to set up our meetings, but I appreciate you all coming out to be available for the committee for this night. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. I just need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Monroe, second.
Member Donovan?
Aye.
Member Green?
Aye.
Member Monroe?
Aye.
And I'm an aye. Okay, motion carries. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'll be in the
Tuesday.
basement.
Thanks.